Barbara was operating inside Operation Black Tide under a cover so deep that even most of the base believed that she was introduced as nothing more than a civilian medical specialist, calm, precise, invisible. While she quietly gathered intelligence, James treated her with open hostility, questioning her presence, humiliating her in front of the team, pushing her every chance he got. During a sudden confrontation under fire, James noticed inconsistencies in her behavior to controlled, to tactical. Convinced she was hiding something, he ordered her restrained. As he shouted accusations, metal biting into her wrists, the situation spiraled out of control. That was when the mission commander arrived. Paul Miller's eyes, not to James, but to Barbara's exposed forearm were tattoo marks, survivors of an impossible, off-the-books operation. He froze. He knew exactly what that symbol meant. Without raising his voice, Miller ordered the cuffs removed immediately. In that instant, everything changed. James realized too late that he had made a catastrophic mistake. Barbara said nothing, but behind her steady gaze, a plan was already forming, quiet, calculated, and devastating. A reckoning that would follow James far beyond that day and force him to confront the consequences of his arrogance in ways he never imagined. But before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Now, let's understand how this story really began. The desert heat pressed down on the forward operating base like a living thing, heavy and suffocating. Fine sand crept into every seam of fabric, every exposed hinge of metal, grinding quietly with each step. The air shimmered above the tarmac, blurring the outlines of HESCO barriers and armored vehicles parked in rigid formation. Barbara Hayes moved through it without urgency. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, skin streaked with dust and dried antiseptic. A medical pack rode high between her shoulder blades, its straps darkened by sweat. She had been on her feet for 11 hours straight, triaging heat casualties, stitching shrapnel wounds, monitoring hydration levels for operators rotating in from perimeter patrols. Her movements were efficient, economical, no wasted motion, no unnecessary words. Inside the medical tent, the smell of iodine and burnt dust clung to the canvas walls. A wounded operator sat on a folding cot, jaw clenched as Barbara irrigated a deep laceration along his forearm. "Pressure's good," she said calmly, eyes never leaving the wound. "You'll keep full function, no nerve involvement." The man nodded once, breathing through his teeth. He trusted her, they all did, even if none of them said it out loud. Outside the tent, boots crunched on gravel. James Reed stopped just short of the entrance. He stood tall, arms crossed over his plague carrier, radio clipped high on his shoulder. His jaw worked slowly, a tight muscle jumping near his temple as his eyes tracked Barbara through the opening. For 3 weeks now, he had watched her with open suspicion, to observant, to composed, to quiet. She didn't look like she belonged to him. "She's playing soldier," he'd said more than once, just loud enough for others to hear. "Wearing a uniform doesn't make you one." Today, his patience finally snapped. He stepped into the tent, his presence immediately changing the air. The wounded operator stiffened. Barbara didn't look up. "Doctor," James said, the word sharp, almost sarcastic. "We need to talk. Give me 30 seconds, she replied. Her tone was even, professional. The suture needle flashed once more, then she taped the dressing in place. "You're cleared for light duty. No patrols until morning." As the operator stood and exited, James blocked his path briefly, eyes flicking from the bandage to Barbara's face. "Out," James ordered. The man hesitated, then obeyed. James turned back to her, his gaze hard. "You've been photographing defensive positions." Barbara removed her gloves slowly, peeling them off inside out. She dropped them into a biohazard bag, then finally met his eyes. "No," she said. "I've seen you with a device," James continued, voice rising just enough to carry beyond the tent, "taking pictures, logging coordinates, sending encrypted messages." Outside, heads began to turn. Operators slowed as they passed, pretending not to listen. Barbara felt the familiar tightening in her chest, not fear, not anger, calculation. "I file medical reports," she said. "Injury patterns, supply requests. Everything goes through encrypted channels." James's lips curled faintly. "Funny how your supply requests always coincide with enemy contact." He raised his hand. "Cuff her." For a fraction of a second, the tent went silent. Then 2 operators stepped forward, uncertain. One glanced at Barbara's face, searching for some satanic protest, anything. There was none. Barbara extended her wrists without a word. The cold metal snapped shut around her skin, biting just enough to draw a thin line of red. She didn't flinch. Her breathing remained slow, controlled. Each inhale measure outside, the base had gone still. James guided her out into the open, the sun glaring off the chains between her wrists. He made sure everyone could see, detaining you for suspected espionage, he announced. Until command decides otherwise, Barbara stood there, dust clinging to her boots, the weight of a dozen stairs pressing into her back. She could end this with a single sentence. One name, one clearance code. She didn't, because the mission came first. A convoy rolled through the northern checkpoint, engines growling low. Commander Paul Miller stepped out of the lead vehicle, scanning the base with quick, practiced eyes. He took in the gathered operators, the tension humming just beneath the surface, and then he saw the cuffs. His gaze dropped to Barbara's forearm, where her sleeve had ridden up under the restraints. The small trident was unmistakable, coordinates etched beneath it. The color drained from his face so fast it was almost imperceptible, like a light being switched off behind his eyes. His breath caught. Just once, take those off, he said. James turned, startled. Sir? Now. Miller repeated. His voice was quiet, but it cut clean through the air. James hesitated. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. With respect, Commander, she's under detention. That's a direct order. The cuffs were removed. Barbara flexed her wrists once, rolling the stiffness out, her expression unchanged. She met Miller's eyes for a brief second. Nothing more was needed. Miller turned to the assembled operators. Everyone. My tent. Immediately, as they dispersed, James stood rooted in place, confusion tightening his features. Barbara stepped past him, her shoulder brushing his arm. You have no idea what you just did, she said quietly. James watched her walk away, a knot forming in his stomach, though he couldn't yet name why. The desert wind shifted, carrying sand across the tarmac. And somewhere beneath the base's steady operational rhythm, something had just broken open. The canvas walls of Miller's command tent muffled the sounds of the base outside, turning the heat into a dense, pressurized stillness. A single overhead light cast sharp shadows across the folding table at the center, where an encrypted military tablet lay dormant, its screen black and reflective. Barbara stood at parade rest near the entrance, wrists still faintly reddened where the cuffs had been. She hadn't rubbed them, she hadn't acknowledged them. Her posture remained precise, spine straight, shoulders relaxed in a way that came only from long habit. James Reed stood opposite her, arms stiff at his sides. His jaw was locked so tightly that a vein pulsed along his neck. He hadn't spoken since entering the tent. His eyes flicked once to Barbara's forearm, then away, as if contact itself carried risk. Commander Miller sealed the tent flap, then activated the tablet. The screen came alive with a soft electronic chime. Operation Neptune's Aero-2019 classification. Level 5. Compartmented. Eyes only. James leaned forward without realizing it, his brow creased. Level 5 compartmented material was rare, restricted even within naval special warfare. The kind of file that erased careers if mishandled. Miller tapped once more. A personnel profile replaced the mission header. Case, Barbara O. Rank, LCDR Unit, DVGRUN SWDG. James felt the air leave his lungs in a short, soundless exhale. His hand curled into a fist at his side, nails biting into the leather of his glove. He stared at the screen, as if waiting for it to correct itself. Miller swiped. After-action imagery filled the display, grainy drone footage. Thermal overlays, red tracers cutting through night terrain. Casualty timestamps scrolled along the margin. 8 insertion icons blinked at the start of the timeline. 5 of them went dark. Miller's voice was measured, stripped of emotion. Neptune's era was an off-books direct action mission. No congressional oversight, no official paper trail. 8 operators inserted under the assumption of low resistance. He paused, letting the images speak. Contact was immediate, ambush-level preparedness. 2 operators critically wounded within the first 3 minutes. 1 Kia on insertion. James swallowed. His eyes burned, though he didn't know why. Miller enlarged a still frame. A single figure moved through chaos, dragging 1 wounded operator, all applying a tourniquet to another, rifle slung but never idle. Even frozen in the image, the efficiency was unmistakable. She extracted both wounded operators under sustained fire. Miller continued. Performed needle decompression and hemorrhage control simultaneously, all coordinating suppressive movement. Alone, James's gaze flicked to Barbara. She hadn't moved. Her expression was neutral, eyes steady, unreadable. Miller turned to face him fully now. She's not playing doctor. James's mouth opened, then closed. A faint tremor ran through his right hand. She earned her trident first, Miller said. Then she went to medical school, combat medicine, trauma surgery. More diplomas than half your platoon combined. The words landed one by one, each heavier than the last. Miller swiped again. Status: survivor 1 of 3. Below it, a photograph of the same trident James had seen moments earlier. The coordinates beneath it glowed faintly. That tattoo, Miller said quietly, marks the survivors. The ones who weren't supposed to make it back. James felt a dull pressure building behind his eyes. He shifted his weight, boots scraping softly against the tent floor. The memory replayed, his voice raised, the cuff snapping shut, the looks from his men. Miller didn't soften his tone. Operation Black Tide has a mole. Someone inside this base is leaking tactical intelligence to hostile forces. Sophisticated enough to embed it in routine logistics traffic. James's head snapped up. You're saying she was inserted undercover? Miller said. Medical specialist, no overt authority, no visible rank. Her job was to identify the leak without triggering countermeasures. Miller glanced toward Barbara. She met his look with a brief nod. Your behavior, Miller continued, turning back to James, was perfect cover. Everyone saw her as exactly what you framed her to be, a civilian doctor out of her depth. No one questioned why she was everywhere. No one questioned her access. James's breathing turned shallow. His shoulders drew inward by a fraction. Miller stepped closer. You publicly humiliated one of the most decorated operators in naval special warfare history. In front of junior SEALs to now have reason to question your judgment. The silence stretched. James stared at the floor, then slowly lifted his gaze to Barbara. His face had lost its color. The certainty he'd carried for weeks was gone, replaced by something raw and unsteady. I didn't know, he said finally. The word sounded inadequate even to him. Barbara said nothing. Her eyes moved not to James, but to the tablet. To the mission timeline, to the gaps where names should have been. Her expression didn't harden, it sharpened. Inside her, calculations rearranged themselves. Cover compromised, power dynamics shifted. The board had changed. James straightened slightly, as if bracing for impact that had already landed. He understood now not just the truth of who she was, but the scale of what he'd done. Barbara finally looked at him. There was no anger there. Only awareness. This changed everything. Night settled over the base, without ceremony. The heat didn't leave it, only thinned, clinging to the air like a held breath. Floodlights cast long, rigid shadows across the compound, bleaching color from everything they touched. Inside Miller's tent, the only illumination came from an encrypted tablet and a secondary laptop shielded by RF blocking mesh. Barbara sat alone at the table, sleeves rolled down now, the trident hidden beneath fabric. Her posture was relaxed, but her eyes moved with surgical precision, tracking data streams that scrolled faster than most people could process. Communications logs filled the screen, routine traffic at first glance. Medical resupply requests, inventory adjustments, requests for additional fluids, antibiotics, trauma kits, boring, expected. She slowed the fee. Her finger tapped once, isolating a sequence. The formatting was subtly off. Not enough to trigger automated flags, but enough to catch a trained eye. Numerical quantities that didn't align with consumption rates. Time-stamped intervals at mirrored patrol departures. Barbara leaned back slightly, exhaling through her nose. Encoding through logistics, old-school tradecraft, executed cleanly. She pulled up historical data, aligning the medical requests with enemy contact reports. Each spike in hostile movement coincided with a specific resupply message, not random. Not sloppy. Military-trained, patient, confident. She cross-referenced personnel access logs next, overlaying them with movement trackers pulled from internal base sensors. Three names surfaced repeatedly: individuals who had proximity to both medical logistics and tactical briefings. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when one pattern refused to resolve. James Reed. He appeared near every compromised operation. Sometimes before, sometimes immediately after. His presence wasn't suspicious on paper. He was the chief operator. He was supposed to be there. Still, the data didn't care about intent. Barbara stared at his movement trail longer than the others. Her thumb hovered over the screen, then dragged his profile aside, isolating it from the rest. She didn't dismiss it. She simply set it aside. Assumptions killed operators faster than bullets. She switched feeds. Compound camera footage populated the display: grainy angles, overlapping fields of view, each stamped with synchronized time codes. She accelerated playback, eyes tracking posture, proximity, body language. That's when she saw it. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, 35, James's second-in-command. In briefing after briefing, Webb positioned himself just off-center, not dominant, not passive. Always within earshot, always with a reason to be there. A question, a clarification, a logistics concern. Barbara rewound the footage, slowed it down. Webb's head angled slightly during sensitive portions of briefings. His eyes never fully left the speaker. Not casual listening, collection, another fee, the medical tent. Webb entered twice in the last 48 hours. Both times with plausible excuses: equipment check, comms interference, a question about radio frequency overlap. His hands lingered near the security equipment crate longer than necessary. His gaze flicked once toward the antenna coupler mounted beneath the exam table. Barbara felt something settle into place. She built the trap carefully. A false intelligence packet, clean, believable, lethal if acted upon. Coordinates for a weapons cache allegedly being staged 12 kilometers east, tucked into rough terrain that would require rapid enemy movement to exploit. She embedded it inside a routine resupply note, masked within dosage ratios. She told only one person, Webb. He didn't react, didn't ask questions. Just nodded once, lips pressed thin, eyes unreadable. Within hours, ISR feeds lit up, enemy movement, combos redirecting. Units converging on the exact coordinates she'd planted. Barbara didn't blink. Confirmation came without emotion. Webb was the mole. She pivoted immediately, accessing deeper layers of traffic: unauthorized device pings, irregular encryption bursts. It took longer to crack, but when she did, her breathing slowed even further. Coded messages, not logistics, not intel drops, operational planning. The timestamps made her spine straighten. Tomorrow. She scrolled through the content, jaw tightening by degrees. Webb wasn't just leaking information. He was orchestrating an attack on the base itself, exploiting compromised defenses, timing it to shift changes, and buried within the message chain specific targeting instructions. Barbara Hayes, Commander Paul Miller. Eliminated during enemy contact, collateral casualties. She locked the tablet, stood, and moved through the darkened compound with purpose. No running, no hesitation. Miller looked up as she entered his tent, already reading her face. "We have less than 8 hours, she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were hard now. Webb is bringing an insurgent assault down on this base. He's compromised the defensive grid, and James's team doesn't know they're walking into a kill zone." Miller's lips pressed together. He didn't ask how she knew. He trusted the result. "What do you need?" he asked. Barbara didn't answer immediately. Her gaze drifted to the tent flap, toward the dark where James Reed was somewhere on duty, unaware, still carrying the weight of his earlier mistake. "James," she said finally, "and I need him to trust me." Miller studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. Outside, the night remained deceptively calm. Inside the wire, the clock was already running. 2,200 hours found the perimeter quiet in the way only combat zones ever were, never truly still, just waiting. The desert wind carried fine grit that whispered against ballistic plates and weapon slings. Beyond the wire, darkness pressed close, broken only by infrared sensors and distant thermal signatures pulsing on mounted displays. James Reed stood watch near the southern sector, rifle held across his chest, weight balanced on the balls of his feet. His gaze swept the horizon in disciplined arcs. The habit was muscle memory. The focus kept his thoughts from spiraling. He sensed her before he saw her, The shift in air. The muted crunch of boots on packed earth. His shoulders tensed, spine straightening a fraction as Barbara Hayes stepped into his peripheral vision. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumped once beneath his left eye. He turned, stopping himself from snapping to attention. She didn't slow. "I don't need your apology," she said, voice low, controlled, pitched to carry no farther than necessary. "I need your help." The words landed harder than any accusation. James's grip tightened on his rifle, his knuckles blanched beneath his gloves. For a moment, he said nothing, eyes fixed somewhere past her shoulder, as if the darkness held answers he didn't. Barbara stepped closer and held out a small encrypted drive. He hesitated before taking it, then slotted it into his wrist-mounted tablet. Data unfolded across the screen: logs, timestamps, movement overlays. Enemy reactions aligned perfectly with internal communications. Medical supply requests encoded with operational intelligence. James scrolled faster, breathing shallow, the tension visible in the rigid set of his neck. Then the name appeared, WEBB. Marcus L. His thumb froze. A flicker crossed his face, disbelief first, sharp and instinctive. Then something colder, harder. Webb had been at his side for 6 years. Kandahar, Helmand, Afghanistan. He could picture the man's grin, hear his voice over comms. "No," James muttered. The word came out rough. Barbara didn't press. She let the silence work. He kept reading. Camera stills, proximity data, the planted intelligence, and the enemy response. The last line hit like a gut punch. Planned attack over 0 hours. James exhaled slowly through his nose. His shoulders dropped, not in relief, but underweight. When he finally looked up, his eyes were darker. "Why tell me?" he asked. His voice was steady, but there was something brittle underneath. "After everything because you made a mistake based on incomplete information," Barbara said. "Webb is actively betraying your team." "There's a difference." James studied her face. Not searching for forgiveness. Assessing credibility, he found no malice there. No satisfaction, just clarity. "What's your plan?" he asked. Barbara knelt, unrolling a laminated sector map across a crate. Red and blue grease markings already traced the base's defensive layout. Weak points glowed like exposed nerves. "Webb's attack comes at 0 for 00, she said. "He's compromised our defensive positions. He knows where we're thin, where response times lag. We can't evacuate, that would tip him off." James crouched beside her, eyes scanning the map. "So we let it happen," he said. "But we control it," she replied. She marked new positions, subtle shifts, nothing that would trigger suspicion. Overlapping fields of fire, choke points disguised as vulnerabilities. Secondary rally points masked as routine patrol adjustments. "I'll establish trauma stations here, and here," she continued, tapping key locations. "Forward, but protected. Hemorrhage control, airway management, rapid evac lanes. If anyone goes down, we buy them minutes. Minutes save lives." James nodded slowly. "You're going to need someone who can move teams without Webb noticing." Her gaze met his, steady and unflinching. "That's why I'm talking to you." The unspoken settled between them. They worked through the night. James briefed his men under the guise of a live-fire readiness drill. His voice was calm, authoritative, no deviation, no cracks. Barbara moved in parallel, inventorying medical supplies, staging tourniquets, plasma, chest seals. She calibrated triage flow with the precision of a surgeon preparing for mass casualty intake. They crossed paths without words, exchanging nods, shared glances that carried entire sentences. 330 hours, teams were in position. Weapons checked, medics staged. Webb moved through the base unaware, posture relaxed, confident in his own deception. Barbara stood near the medical tent, adjusting her gloves. Across the compound, James caught her eye. He nodded once. The storm was coming. 400 hours arrived without warning. The first explosion ripped through the outer perimeter, like a hammer strike, violent, precise, wrong. The blast echoed across the compound, but the breach wasn't where the intelligence said it would be. Not even close. Webb's data was useless. Secondary detonations followed, staggered, chaotic. Dust and shrapnel punched into the air, alarm screaming to life as floodlights snapped on. The base shifted instantly from sleep to motion. Boots hit gravel. Bolts slammed forward. Radios crackled with clipped, disciplined calls. Insurgents poured through the gaps they believed were soft only to run headlong into interlocking fields of fire. SEAL teams rose from cover like machinery engaging, controlled bursts. Short, violent engagements, bodies fell where they stood. The kill zones Barbara had drawn on a map became real in seconds. Inside the medical station, Barbara was already moving. A wounded operator was dragged in, blood pumping bright and arterial from a thigh wound. She dropped to one knee, hands steady, fingers slick as she drove a tourniquet high and tight. The man's breathing hitched sharp, shallow. She leaned in, voice low, cutting through the chaos. "Stay with me. Look at me. Breathe." Her rifle hung across her back, weight familiar. When the tent flap snapped open again, she didn't look up until the wrong sound followed, boots to light, a breath held too long. She pivoted, rifle coming up in one smooth motion. The hostiles crossed the threshold. She fired twice. Center mass, no hesitation. The recoil barely registered, the bodies hit the dirt hard enough to rattle the gurney. She slung the weapon back and returned to the wounded operator without missing a beat, fingers already packing gauze, sealing the wound, her jaw set as if nothing had interrupted her work. Outside, James Reed was everywhere. He moved with ruthless economy, issuing commands that cut through the nose. His team flowed where he directed them, trusting the plan, trusting him. But his eyes kept flicking, tracking one man in particular, Webb. Webb wasn't where he should have been. He was moving too freely, too deliberately. And in the middle of the firefight, his hand came up not to his weapon, but to a small encrypted device. James saw the angle of his head. The way his lips moved, transmitting. James didn't shout, he didn't hesitate. He slammed into Webb from the side, driving him into the dirt mid-transmission. The device skidded across the ground, still blinking. Webb reacted instantly, rolling, striking back with brutal efficiency. Years of training met desperation. They grappled hard, gear clattering, breath sharp and animal. Webb twisted free just long enough to draw a knife. The blade flashed once, catching James across the arm. Blood darkened his sleeve immediately. James grunted but didn't disengage. Webb lunged again. He never saw Barbara. She came up behind him, timing perfect. Her hand trapped his wrist, redirected the blade, her other arm snapping around his neck. A textbook SEAL close quarters maneuver, clean, violent, final. She dropped her weight and drove him into the ground. Webb hit hard. The air left his lungs in a raw, involuntary sound. Before he could recover, James was on him, pinning him down, breath ragged now, jaw clenched so tight a vein stood out along his temple. "Friendlies coming through." Miller's voice cut over the net, steady, authoritative. Moments later, reinforcements flooded the compound, real ones. Units that hadn't been on Webb's chessboard. He'd called them hours ago, after Barbara's briefing, quietly, without ceremony. The insurgents broke, some ran, some fell. The rest disappeared back into the dark they'd come from. Dawn crept in slow and pale, revealing the aftermath. Spent brass littered the ground, smoke drifted low. Blood stained the dust, but every friendly was alive. Webb sat zip-tied near the center of the compound, breathing hard, face twisted with fury. His eyes locked on Barbara as she approached. "You think this is over," he spat. "You have no idea how deep this goes. There are others, and they know about you now." Barbara knelt in front of him, close enough that he could see his reflection in her eyes. "Let them come," she said. Webb barked a bitter laugh, flecks of spit on his lips. "Reed will never forgive himself for doubting you. That guilt, it's going to eat him alive. You don't even have to do anything, he's already destroyed himself." Barbara stood slowly. Her face gave nothing away, but the word stayed. 3 days after the compound fell silent, the machinery of accountability finished turning, the debriefs were sealed. Webb was transferred under armed escort to military detention, wrists cinched behind his back with plastic restraints that bit into the skin. Operation Black Tide was officially logged as a success. The leak identified, the perimeter held, every friendly extracted alive. On paper, it was clean. Barbara Hayes stood at the edge of the operations tent and felt none of the release that usually followed closure. Her posture remained straight, shoulders squared, hands steady at her sides. Victory had a weight to it this time, dense, unresolved. James Reed was coming apart. He moved through the days, a command operating on borrow oxygen. He spoke only when necessary, voice clipped to bare essentials. He volunteered for every patrol that pushed the wire, every overwatch slot that faced the longest fields of fire. Sleep became optional. When he was ordered into briefings with Barbara present, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder, jaw tight, a muscle jumping near his temple as if restrained by force alone. During weapons maintenance, his discipline fray. The rifle lay disassembled on the bench, parts aligned with habitual precision, yet his hands betrayed him. As he ran a claw through the barrel, a faint tremor rippled through his fingers. He paused, clenched his fist once, then resumed slower now, as if daring the shake to return. It did. Barbara noticed. She always did. This wasn't the hollowed stare of combat fatigue or the adrenaline crash after sustained contact. She had seen that too many times in mirrors, in teammates, in men who woke choking on smoke that wasn't there. This was different. This was the damage that came from crossing a line you believed defined you. Moral injury. The kind that didn't heal with rest or medals because it wasn't the body that had been violated. The junior operators felt it before anyone said a word. Orders were followed, but with a fractional delay, a glance exchanged before movement. Questions asked that would never have surfaced weeks earlier. Reed's authority, once absolute, now carried static. The team's rhythm so finely tuned it bordered on instinct began to stutter. Miller intercepted Barbara near the communications rack, voice low, eyes scanning the tent opening out of habit. "Reed's falling apart," he said. "He's a liability right now." Barbara didn't answer immediately, her breathing stayed even, measured. "Give me 48 hours, she said at last. Midnight found James alone on the range. Floodlights carved harsh cones through the darkness, illuminating dust and brass as they scattered across the concrete. He fired without pause, magazine after magazine, the crack of each round echoing off the berm. His stance was rigid, shoulders locked, breath shallow. The targets bore the evidence. His groupings wandered still lethal, but undisciplined, sloppy, by his standards. Barbara approached from his blind side, boot silent on the gravel. "You need to sleep," she said. "I need to not be a complete piece of shit." He didn't lower the rifle, another burst. The muzzle dipped too early. "You're anticipating recoil," she observed, tone neutral. He exhaled sharply. "I had you handcuffed," he said, words tearing out of him now. "Dragged you through camp like a criminal, humiliated you in front of the entire team. Questioned your integrity while you were the only reason half of them are breathing. You made a tactical assessment based on the information you had. Don't." He finally lowered the weapon and turned. The lights caught the red lining his eyes, the strain etched deep into his face. "Don't make excuses for me. I let my ego and my prejudices compromise my judgment. People could have died because I was too busy trying to prove you didn't belong." Barbara said nothing. She let the silence do the work. "Webb was right," James continued, voice rough. "I can't undo this. Every time those men look at me, they're going to remember that I went after you instead of the actual threat. My career's over, my reputation's destroyed. And I earned every bit of it." Barbara stepped closer. Close enough that he had to see her. "You're right," she said. "You can't undo it." He flinched, just slightly. "But you can learn from it," she went on. "You can become the leader who never makes that mistake again. The operator who checks his assumptions, who listens before acting, who values competence over ego." His brow creased. "Why would you even want that? Why help me after?" "Because Webb wants you destroyed," she said, cutting him off. "He told us that guilt would eat you alive. And I'll be damned if I let that traitorous bastard win." Something shifted in James's expression. Not absolution, the weight was still there. But beneath it, a new alignment, purpose finding purchase. "What do I need to do?" he asked quietly. Barbara allowed herself a small, controlled smile. "Start by fixing your grip," she said, nodding at the rifle. "You're anticipating recoil, that's why your groupings are off." She reached for the weapon, hand steady as ever. 2 weeks passed with the slow, grinding rhythm of recovery. James Reed did not return to himself all at once. He moved deliberately now, words chosen with care, eyes lingering an extra beat before issuing an order. The tremor in his hands faded, replaced by a controlled stillness, but the weight never fully left his posture. It sat between his shoulders like a rucksack he refused to set down. Functional, yes, but change. Barbara had begun the quiet process of rotation. Gear inventoried, medical logs finalized. Her presence in the compound was already thinning, her role officially complete. That was when Miller summoned her back to the operations tent. He didn't waste time. "Wed's talking," Miller said, voice low, jaw locked. His fingers drummed once against the table before he stilled them. "And it's worse than we thought." Barbara remained standing. One hand rested on the back of a chair, knuckles whitening almost imperceptibly. "Talk," he says. "There's a network. Active duty SEALs, CIA handlers, private contractors, all selling intelligence to the highest bidder." Miller's eyes flicked up to hers. "Neptune's era wasn't a victory, it was a setup." The words landed with surgical precision. "They were trying to eliminate you," Miller continued, "and the other survivors. Because you saw something you weren't supposed to." Barbara felt the temperature drop in her chest. Her pulse slowed, sharpened. "Who?" "He won't name names. But he says the proof is buried in the Neptune's Arrow after-action report. Something was redacted, something big enough to expose the entire network." Her mind was already moving, rewinding years in seconds. The mission brief that never quite aligned. The last-minute change to the extraction point. The way enemy forces converge with impossible timing. She had filed it away as chaos, as the inevitable friction of war, operational fog, not betrayal. "The original report was classified above my clearance," Miller said. "The web claims one person still has access to the unredacted version. Someone active, someone currently assigned to Naval Special Warfare Command." He turned the tablet toward her. The name stared back, Captain Richard Vance. Barbara's breath caught before she could stop it. "No," she said. The word barely audible. "Not Vance. Her former commanding officer. The man who had written her recommendations in ink that carried weight. The man who had signed off on her transfer, who had shaken her hand before deployments and told her to come back alive." "Webb says Vance has been running it for 8 years. Miller replied. "Says he personally ordered the hit on Neptune's Arrow survivors. Says you're target number 1 because you're the only one skilled enough to unravel it." Barbara lowered herself into the chair. The movement was controlled, but heavy, as if gravity had abruptly increased. If Vance was involved, there was no shallow end to this pool. He had access to everything: operator identities, classified taskings, future deployments. The entire architecture of naval special warfare ran through desks like his. The tent flap shifted. James stepped inside. His eyes moved from Miller to Barbara, reading the room before anyone spoke. "What's going on?" Miller briefed him. The confusion in James's expression hardened into something darker. His jaw flexed once, sharply. "Vance," he said. "The guy who wrote the handbook on SEAL ethics. Who lectures about honor and integrity like it's scripture. The best cover," Barbara said quietly, "is the appearance of virtue." Her tablet vibrated against the table, encrypted. Unknown sender. She opened it. "You're getting close. Back off or read dice first, then Miller. Then you watch everyone you care about disappear. You have 72 hours to stand down." James leaned in, reading over her shoulder. One corner of his mouth twitched, not humor, but recognition of threat. "Well," he said flatly, "that's not ominous at all." Barbara's jaw set. A fine line formed between her brows as she locked the tablet and slid it aside. "They just made a mistake," she said. "They showed us they're worried." Miller nodded once. "Which means?" "It means we're right," Barbara replied. "What's your play?" Miller asked. Her fingers were already moving, typing rapidly, accessing systems she shouldn't have been able to touch. "Vance doesn't know we know. That's our advantage. We need the unredacted Neptune's Arrow report." She stopped typing and looked up at James. "You said you couldn't undo your mistake," she said. "Here's your chance to make it right. I need someone I can trust to watch my back on the most dangerous operation of our careers." James didn't blink. The answer was already there, waiting. "When do we leave?" Naval Special Warfare Command rose out of Coronado like a self-contained city, concrete and glass wrapped in layers of access control and quiet authority. 2 days after Miller's briefing, Barbara Hayes and James Reed crossed its perimeter in civilian clothes that fit too well to be casual. Their forged credentials identified them as Department of Defense auditors assigned to review mission efficiency protocols, language bland enough to deflect curiosity, official enough to open doors. The base swallowed them without resistance. Thousands of personnel moved with practiced purpose, boots on concrete, conversations clipped and low. Cameras tracked every corridor, badge readers chimed softly as they passed. Barbara's gaze stayed forward, posture unremarkable, the slight tension in her jaw hidden behind the neutrality of a visiting civilian. James walked half a step behind her, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes scanning reflections in polished surfaces. Building 7 did not announce itself, no signage, no flags. Just another structure unless you knew what it was. Its absence from public maps was intentional. They cleared the first security checkpoint. Barbara slid her credentials across the desk. The young SEAL manning the terminal glanced at the screen, then at her face, then back to the screen. His finger tapped once. Green light, good to go, he said, already turning to the next task. The elevator ride to the 3rd floor passed in silence. James exhaled slowly through his nose as the doors opened. The hallway was quiet, carpeted to deaden sound. At the far end sat Captain Richard Vance's office, the biometric lock leaned dully under the recessed lighting. Barbara reached into her bag and withdrew a compact device no larger than a smartphone. Her fingers moved with precise economy as she aligned it against the scanner. The device hummed once, replicating the fingerprint she had lifted from a high-resolution photograph taken at a recent ceremony. The scanner pulsed, click, the door unlocked. Inside, the office was pristine, no clutter, no personal chaos. Awards were mounted with museum-level symmetry: bronze stars, a silver star, commendations framed in matte black. Photographs showed Vance smiling beside 3 different presidents, the image of American heroism carefully curated. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish. Barbara crossed to the classified terminal. "This will take 15 minutes, she said quietly. "Watch the door." James positioned himself near the hallway, back straight, eyes fixed downrange. "You really think the proof is in here?" Webb was specific. Barbara replied without looking up. "If Vance is running this network, he needs to know exactly what was redacted." Her fingers flew. Layers of military-grade encryption peeled back one by one under tools designed by people who understood the system from the inside. The screen flickered. Directories populated. She found it. Operation Neptune Zero. Original classification. Her hands stilled. The room seemed to narrow as she read. The mission had never been about extracting a high-value target. It was an execution order. To target a Saudi intelligence officer who had uncovered the corruption network. Barbara's team had been deployed not as operators, but as expendable assets. The objective wasn't success, it was erasure. The casualties weren't losses, they were outcomes. The 3 survivors were mistakes, every name on the list, every timestamp. It was all there, clinical and deliberate. Murder dressed as mission failure. "Barbara." James's voice came sharp through the doorway. "We have company." She looked up. Through the office window, Captain Vance strode down the hallway, posture immaculate, expression unreadable. 6 armed security personnel flanked him, spacing perfect, hands near weapons. "Copy the files," James hissed. "I'll buy you time." "James, don't." He was already moving, stepping into the hallway, placing himself squarely between Vance's group and the office door. Barbara's breath caught as she initiated the transfer. Her hands trembled despite her control. 30 seconds, 20. From the hallway, James's voice carried, steady. "Captain Vance, didn't expect to see you stateside." Vance stopped. His eyes flicked past James, toward the office. "I could say the same, Chief Reed. Why are you in my building?" "With Dr. Hayes. Routine audit, sir," James said. "Commander Miller sent us to." "Miller is dead. Chief Reed." The words cut cleanly. "Killed in action 3 hours ago," Vance continued, tone almost sympathetic. "Training accident. Tragic." A pause, "which means there is no one who authorized your presence here. No one who knows you're here, and no one who will come looking for you." The file transfer completed with a soft chime. Barbara slid the encrypted drive into her pocket. Her mind assessed the room in rapid succession. The window 3 stories up, the door Vance and 6 armed hostiles. The air vent too small. She was out of options. Barbara lifted her eyes, jaw set, breath held just long enough to steady herself. She was trapped. Barbara stepped into the hallway with her hands visible, palms open, her movements controlled and unhurried. The fluorescent lights overhead reflected off the polished floor, throwing long shadows behind the line of armed security. Her breathing slowed deliberately, each inhale measured, each exhale silent. "Captain Vance," she said evenly, "it's been a long time." Vance's mouth curved into a familiar smile, pleasant, almost paternal. The same expression he had worn in briefing rooms and award ceremonies, the same mask. "Barbara, I'd hoped you would take the warning seriously, disappear, live quietly. But you were never good at letting things go." "Miller isn't dead," she replied, her voice flat. "That was a test, to see if you'd slip." Vance didn't blink. "Actually, he is. I confirmed it myself. Live fire exercise, training accident. Very unfortunate." James's jaw tightened. The tendons in his neck stood out as his fists clenched at his sides. Barbara caught the movement in her peripheral vision and gave a barely perceptible shake of her head. "Not yet. You killed 8 operators during Neptune's arrow," Barbara said, stepping half a pace forward. "Good people, my friends, because they saw something they weren't supposed to." Vance sighed, almost indulgent. "They saw me meeting with someone I shouldn't have been meeting with. A Saudi intelligence officer who paid extremely well for information. Your team stumbled onto the meeting. The mission parameters changed accordingly. You're confessing?" James asked, disbelief roughening his voice. Vance's eyes flicked to him. "Why not? You're both about to suffer tragic accidents, and even if you somehow transmitted those files, they'll be dismissed. I have 3 decades of impeccable service." His gaze sharpened. "You, Chief Reed, recently suffered a psychological episode after falsely accusing a fellow officer. Unstable, that's what the report will say." Barbara's mind worked in clean, precise calculations. 6 armed personnel, Vance at the center. She was unarmed. Screening had been thorough. James had a concealed blade, but steel wouldn't stop rounds at this distance. Then she noticed the camera, mounted high in the corner. Indicator light glowing steady red, recording. And Vance was still talking. "The network will continue," he said calmly. 12 years, 6 countries. Contractors, shell corporations, offshore accounts. Even if you exposed me, the others would survive." "Others like Webb?" Barbara asked. Vance's lip curled. Webb was expendable. A useful idiot who mistook proximity for power. "The real players are admirals, generals, politicians." His smile returned. "People you can't touch." Barbara took another step forward. The security detail shifted subtly, weight changing, fingers brushing triggers. "You're right about one thing," she said. "I can't touch them." She reached into her pocket and drew out her phone. Tapped once, every screen in the building flickered. Monitors in offices, hallways, operation centers, each one filled with Vance's face, his voice echoing back through the corridor. His words, his confession, "Live." The color drained from his face. The smile collapsed. "What did you—" "Miller isn't dead," Barbara said, her tone unchanged. "That part was a lie, but your confession, that's real. And it just went to JSOC, Naval Special Warfare Command, and the Inspector General. All of it, unedited." The hallway erupted with motion. Doors slammed open, boots thundered. Military police poured in, uniformed, armed, unmistakably legitimate. "Captain Richard Vance," the lead investigator announced, voice carrying authority that brooked no argument. "You are under arrest for treason, murder of military personnel, and conspiracy against the United States." Vance lunged. James moved without thought. He drove into Vance's center mass, the impact sending both men into the wall. Years of humiliation, guilt, and restrained fury detonated in that instant. Vance hit the floor hard. When the MPS pulled James back, Vance lay barely conscious, blood seeping from a split brow. Barbara stood over him, her expression unreadable. "You were wrong about something else," she said quietly. "Miller did send us. Every step was sanctioned. Every word you said documented. You spent 12 years building your network. We dismantled it in 3 weeks." Vance was dragged away, his protests dissolving into incoherent rage. James remained where he was, chest rising unevenly. "Miller's really alive." "Very much so," Barbara replied. "He's testifying right now. 17 arrests in the last hour." James let out a breath he'd been holding for days. That was insane. Barbara's gaze followed the MPS down the corridor. That was justice. 3 months later, the tribunal's verdicts had settled into the official record with the weight of permanence. Captain Richard Vance was sentenced to life imprisonment at Fort Leavenworth, his medals stripped, his name erased from walls that once celebrated him. 8 other senior officers faced charges that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The network, meticulously built over more than a decade, had been dismantled piece by piece, its arteries cut, its silence broken. Barbara Haystow at Arlington National Cemetery beneath a pale autumn sky. Rows of white headstones stretched in disciplined formation, unmawed, relentless in their symmetry. A memorial service gathered quietly near a newly placed marker honoring the 8 operators lost during Neptune's era. Their families stood close together, parents with rigid shoulders, spouses holding hands too tightly, children staring at names carved into stone. They were too young to fully understand. For the first time, they had the truth, not rumors. Not euphemisms, truth. Barbara's jaw tightened as a folded flag was passed from gloved hands to a grieving mother. She kept her posture straight, her breathing shallow, eyes fixed forward. The trident on her forearm felt heavier than usual beneath her sleeve. James Reed approached without sound, stopping a respectful distance away. His dress blues were immaculate, ribbons aligned with precision. The tremor that once haunted his hands was gone, but the restraint in his movements remained controlled, intentional. "Thought I'd find you here," he said quietly. "They deserved better," Barbara replied, her eyes never leaving the graves. "They deserved to come home." James followed her gaze. "Because of you. Their families finally know what happened. That's not nothing." They stood in silence as flowers were placed, petals brushing marble. A child knelt, touching a name with careful fingers. "I got my new orders," James said, after a long pause. "Training command." Barbara turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge him. "They want me teaching," he continued. "Apparently someone thought I'd learned a few lessons worth passing on." A faint smile touched the corner of her mouth. It didn't reach her eyes, hard to imagine who that could be. He shifted, drawing a slow breath. "Barbara," his voice steadied. "I need to say this properly." She faced him fully now. "I humiliated you because I was threatened by your competence," he said. "Because admitting how exceptional you were meant confronting my own insecurities. I let ego and prejudice override judgment. I nearly destroyed you and the team. What I did was inexcusable." His throat tightened. "You didn't deserve it." "I'm sorry." Barbara studied him. The guilt was still there, etched into the lines around his eyes, but it had changed. It no longer festered, it informed. "Apology accepted," she said. "Not because it was okay, but because you actually changed." James exhaled, tension leaving his shoulders. "What about you? What are your orders?" Her expression shifted. Something sharp surfaced beneath the calm. "Purpose." Vance said the real players were untouchable, she said. "Admirals, generals, politicians." James nodded once. He was wrong. Barbara continued. "Miller and I kept digging. Names, accounts, connections. The work isn't finished. You're going after them. Someone has to." James met her eyes. "Need backup." She considered him the man who once doubted her, now stripped down to something more durable. "Maybe," she said. "But not yet. You've got SEALs to train. Make sure they learn the right lessons, that competence matters more than rank. That assumptions kill. I can do that." They shook hands, not as former adversaries, but as allies forged under pressure. Barbara walked toward her car, past the endless white stones. Sunlight caught the trident on her forearm, the coordinates of a mission meant to erase her. Instead, it had defined her. Behind her, James raised a final salute to the Neptune's Aero Memorial. The war wasn't over, but today, justice had won. And Barbara Hayes was just getting started. If you want to see where her mission goes next, subscribe to the channel and stay with us.